Hello everyone, I'm Logan and welcome to the Game of Nerds. Bryan Singer's latest adventure in the X-Men universe is definitely a divisive one, but I am here to finally say once and for all whether or not this apocalypse is world-ending. X-Men Apocalypse is not the best. Okay, it's not horrible, it's not the worst X-Men movie we've ever seen, but it's definitely not even close to the best. For context, my favorite X-Men movie is Matthew Vaughn's X-Men First Class, followed by the original X-Men in 2000, and then X2. I wasn't the biggest fan of Days of Future Past, and I just watched it recently again, and I still really don't like it. I think the biggest problem for me is the characters, and the understanding of the characters and that timeline. Before we get to that mess, let's talk story. Honestly, the story isn't horrible. If you look at the overall story, just looking at the story points, this is an awesome movie. And it could have been. The story is cool and the concepts are all there, but what ended up on screen is not great. It by no means lived up to what it could have and should have been. And I think the major problem there comes from director Bryan Singer's choices. How everything played out on screen was just disappointing. And he could have been limited by the studio about what he could and could not do, but I really don't think that's the case here. Fox seems to trust him with this universe, for better or for worse. Okay, characters. We have a ton of interesting characters to talk about, but just like the movie, let's ignore the few that don't matter as much. Let's talk about the main characters of this movie. Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique, Michael Fassbender as Magneto, James McAvoy as Charles Xavier, Ty Sheridan as Scott Summers Cyclops, and Sophie Turner as Jean Grey. And you know what? Let's throw in Quicksilver and Wolverine too, why not? I'm going to start this off by praising McAvoy. In my opinion, he's given the most solid performance in this franchise. He just knows how to sell the dialogue. Fassbender does his job well enough here, and many people are saying that Jennifer Lawrence is phoning in her performance, but I don't agree with that. I think she has problems with her performance, but they lie elsewhere. Each film that she's in has her leaving Xavier to seemingly become the villain in the future, which she should be, but she always comes back. Why? Because she's Jennifer Lawrence. We know from the beginning that she won't be the bad guy, because that doesn't sell tickets. And same goes for Magneto. They've recreated these characters to always side with Xavier at the end. Look, I think most comic readers would agree that the best villains in Marvel history are Doctor Doom and Magneto. And honestly, Fox has changed these characters into something they aren't, simply for profit. I get it, Magneto would help Xavier in the comics if the world was about to end, unless he's trying to become God or whatever. But in this film, Apocalypse had the goal that Magneto as a villain should have, for mutants to rule. Also, quick side note, Apocalypse was pretty generic and not at all terrifying. Oscar Isaac is one of the best actors out there right now, but I think his performance was pretty limited by the makeup. Now let's move on to the newer performances of the new old characters. Ty Sheridan as Cyclops, Scott Summers, and Sophie Turner as Jean Grey were alright. I think Sheridan was good as Scott, and I'd like to see him develop the character more in future films, but in this film, just something about the characterization was wrong for me. In one scene, he's the new kid, the shy outcast, and then literally the next scene, he is ditching school, stealing a car, and taking his new friends to the mall. It was a complete shift with no development. It's almost as if they needed the main characters and Jubilee, who was way underused again, to leave the mansion, and that was the motivation for that scene. That was it. Anyway, Sophie Turner as Jean Grey was not great. Her accent was passable, and the lines she delivered were pretty flat. Again, I think that's probably due partially to the accent. I don't think she was horrible, but again, it comes down to the characterization. She was just not interesting. And Jean Grey is one of the most interesting characters you could possibly have in any media. There was absolutely nothing to make me want to root for the character, and nothing made me want to see more. And then we get to Quicksilver and Wolverine, who I think were last-minute add-ons to the script. I think after the much-beloved Quicksilver scene in Days of Future Past, The creative team scrambled for a way to do it all again. And they did it well. The sequence is fun and light in this dark movie, but it's nothing new. We've seen it before. It offers nothing to take away besides it being longer. And then after that sequence, the character could not exist and it wouldn't change the movie at all. And then there's Hugh Jackman. He is in this movie just because. There is absolutely no reason for him to be in this movie. In fact, the setting of this scene has no reason to be in this movie except for the fact that Wolverine happens to be there. It was useless and really awkward. Okay, now we get to the part that makes me really angry. The timeline. Here's the thing, they could have fixed all of their problems with the timeline if they would have done two things. One, recast Wolverine after X-Men Origins, and two, use First Class as a hard reboot to the series. Even if they decided to keep Jackman around, they would have been fine. But then they decided to do Days of Future Past. That is where the timeline dies, and from then on, it makes no sense. And then it gets worse with this film, so much so that it's actually distracting. X-Men Apocalypse takes place 10 years after Days of Future Past, and 20 years after First Class, which leaves the characters of Xavier, Magneto, and Mystique in their mid to late 40s during Apocalypse. The only character that this kind of works for is Mystique, because unless all mutants have slower aging rates, which they don't, none of the characters look like they've aged a year since First Class. And then Quicksilver still looks exactly the same after 10 years and is still living in his mom's basement around the age of 30. And then Havoc is close to the age of 40 while his brother Cyclops is in high school still. It makes sense, kind of, but it's just not right. It's just distracting. There's no reason this movie should have taken place 10 years after Days of Future Past. It could have taken place 2, maybe 3 years afterwards, and it would have been fine. In fact, it probably would have been better. They've obviously just given up on the timeline making sense. According to producer Simon Kinberg, the next time we will see the X-Men is in the 90s. And then following that, the 2000 film X-Men. They should have just done a hard reboot. And there is so much more to talk about. Mystique is practically Katniss Everdeen now. The uselessness of the Four Horsemen. The new X-Men costumes, which look comic accurate, but they look really weird and awkward in the universe they've built up. The old worn out title sequences. The post-credit sequence that you will really only understand if you really love the comics. And a lot more. But Bryan Singer, you were right. The third movie in a series is always the worst. Although I'm gonna bet this won't be the last time we see these characters. I'm gonna give X-Men Apocalypse 2 out of 6 X's. So what did you think? Am I completely off base, or are you as annoyed with this timeline as I am? Leave your comments down below letting me know. As always, check us out at thegameofnerds.com. Charlie's also doing her review of X-Men Apocalypse and she's throwing that up on the website. So go check that out, as well as all the awesome daily content that we have for you up there. Also follow us at The Game of Nerds on Facebook and Twitter. We post updates all the time about your favorite properties. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one. I'm Logan Ferry. Sorry, Hugh Jackman. Thanks for watching.